Hey there, Marcus from Heeltoe Automotive. We're going to be looking at some Tein coilover kits, and in particular we're going to try to address a number of questions we get from especially our Acura owners. The difference between a Street Advance Z and a Flex Z, and a little bit more about our upper mount option that we offer on the website. I've got a Street Advance Z here, kind of already started. And out of the box, you're going to find that you got a coil and a damper. And this is basically it. This is a glorified shock and spring setup. They come with a new bump stop, which is great, and these collars on the bottom are adjustable for the height. They come all the way down, so when you get your kit, you're going to want to do some adjustment here. There are some heights already in here. Read the manual, and it will give you some baseline measurements to judge the height of your car before you even put these in. Usually when we get these, we set them about 1.5 inches to start off with, and then you can adjust from there. Also coming with these kits is a set of spanner wrenches. These wrenches are what you're going to use to loosen and tighten these collars at the bottom. Usually one goes in one hand and one goes in the other, and you would push them away like this to tighten them down. There is a plastic Delrin washer here, and the reason why that washer is there is so that when this is assembled in the car and the spring is on, there's going to be probably a little bit of pressure here. And what it allows is some easier moving of this spring seat adjustment even with the spring in place. It allows some slipping there. Also, you'll see that this threaded section is sort of a dark coat. It is a sort of a non-stick, corrosion resistant finish, and basically what that's going to do for you, especially if you live in a climate where there is a lot of excess road salt, these will still allow some adjustment even after they've been exposed to the elements. They're not corrosion proof, so what we do recommend to people is, you know, maybe once a season or a couple times a season, get in here and clean. This powder coating on here is really pretty durable. These are really great replacement shocks. Also, important thing to note is these are actually shorter than the factory units are, and that means just by putting this in the car, you're going to get some lowering even at the baseline height, which is, you know, sort of going to be in the middle of these threads. A lot of people like to run them all the way down so they can get this super mega slam, and at that point we start saying, well, there's a window of travel that this damper is really going to work the best in, and if you're going to run them all the way down, or even sometimes folks have taken out one of these collars, we would probably recommend jumping up to a Flex Z at that point. The main difference between the Flex Z and the Street Advance Z is going to be how this height adjustment is accomplished. And here we have a Flex Z. So what you'll notice right away is, first of all, there's an upper mount that already comes on the Flex Z. So the Flex Z does cost a little bit more than a Street Advance Z, and that's one of the reasons why. Another reason why is there's a little bit of extra componentry here. You can see that the Flex Z has a separate lower base here, whereas this one is built into the shock base. So with that loose, you can see that this collar spins up, and we can actually move this lower bracket up or down. And by doing that, we're going to change the whole entire length. You'll remember that I said that this Street Advance Z was already shorter than the factory setup. Well, this one is adjustable for height. So while you adjust the height at the spring seats here, you would adjust the whole length down here. And what that does for you is it allows you to maintain a fixed travel range as you raise and lower the car. So when you change this, you're not changing this relative height up here. A lot of people call that preload. The Street Advance Z, you adjust the height by adjusting the preload. And while that's kind of sort of true in a backwards sort of way, really the preload here isn't adjustable separately from the height. And so that's why this set, we refer to it as full length adjustment, because the adjustment happens in the full length of the damper, and the height is adjustable independent of the preload. So you don't adjust the height with preload on the Street Advance, you're just adjusting the height, and preload is affected a little bit, but mostly preload is something that comes into play when you've got a system like this. So what is preload? Basically the height of this distance collar between the spring seat and the upper mount. A certain length of spring will fit in here, and the more you thread these spring perches up, because they can go up, you're going to be adding a little bit of preload on the spring. Why do they call it preload? Because The spring is always going to have some load on it when it's in the car. When it's not in the car, there might not be any load on the spring if these collars are adjusted down. Sometimes you'll see if the spring is loose in here, there's actually no preload at all. But once you put the car on, it starts loading up the spring. Preload is if you adjust these collars up a little bit and put some compression on the spring, that's going to preload the spring before it's on the ground with the car sitting on it. So what does preload do? Why would you use preload? Preload has the effect of tightening up the spring a little bit so that it gives it a higher effective spring rate. So let's just say this is a 10 kilogram spring here. If we add like a half an inch of preload, it's going to act a little bit more like an 11 or a 12 kilogram spring. So if you want a little bit more firm suspension, you can add a little bit of preload. It's gotten very popular these days to change around spring rates. It's better to adjust the preload a little bit to see how much stiffer you really need to be. If you find yourself adding preload and it's just not enough for your needs, then jumping up in spring rate is a good idea. On systems like this, they're rather comfortable for the street, and so what you'll probably find is that the stock preload might be a little soft or just right for you. So we usually add a little bit if you want a little more performance. That's a lot about full length adjustment.
And I pulled the upper mounts off of the Flex Z damper just because I was really curious to know what the travel range difference was going to be between these two. If you're unaware, a lot of the way that the ride of the car is determined is based on how much actual stroke is here in the shock shaft. And I've got rear dampers here because a lot of people also don't realize that the rear is really where you're going to find most of the ride quality. The front going over bumps doesn't necessarily have a big impact on the ride, but the rear does. You'll notice, first of all, that they have a really similar bump stop. It looks to be probably the same part number. Bump stops actually play a pretty big role in the ride too, because as the car is traveling up and down over bumps, if you hit a really big bump, boom, and you end up hitting this bump stop, the compound and the way that this is designed is going to have a bigger impact over how that large bump is ultimately absorbed under full compression. Just superficially looking at it, the travel is about the same, but it almost looks larger on the Flex Z. So when I measure, you're measuring from the bump stop to basically the bottom of that washer, and it's 3 7/8 inches. And we move over to the Flex Z, the washer wobbles a little bit, but it's more than 4. It's almost 4 1/4 inches. That was actually really surprising to me, because usually when you get a full-length damper like this, it's usually going to be a short stroke design in most any coilover design like this. And Tein, when they revised their original Flex Winding Master kit into the Street Flex, they purposefully added more stroke in the rear end. This normally would be a lot shorter in a more performance-y track type setup. But Tein recognized that people would want to have more travel on the street to give them a better ride. It's really kind of impressive to see that much travel in the rear on this TL application. Again, this is 04 to 08 TL, but they've put a similar design philosophy into all their Flex Zs. These two dampers compared to each other, they're going to have a really similar ride profile. The valving is very similar between the two. I think you're going to get a little higher spring rate with the Flex Z. Also the spring, you'll notice the spring smaller as well. This is the Flex Z spring, about 2.5 inches between the coils, and this one is going to be, I'm spitballing, 3.5. So you got a larger coil on the Street Advance. That's going to help give a little bit better ride than the smaller one here, but this is more prevalently able to be swapped out for different rates as well. So the Flex, it gives you a lot more options. It was originally called the Flex because it's really a highly flexible setup. Adjusting the lower bracket to change the height, independent preload settings here, and now we find like you can do more with different spring rates. You can add some preload to make this more of a performance type setup, which is what I have in my TSX. A little bit of extra preload makes it a really great track setup for a casual track day, or a really heavy duty track car is probably going to find that these are rather underdampened. But really, for your general just dude driving around that wants 1.5 inches or so lowering, the Street Advance Z is still a really fantastic damper kit. It's just really surprising to see that you're not taking much of a compromise in ride affecting impacts, such as like this stroke is just is huge. It's bigger even than the Street Advance Z. These two do tend to be our #1 go-tos for suspension on Accords, TLs, TSXs that are all street driven and even like light track use, because they put the extra thought and time into the design to make sure that they would work really well for all kinds of different uses.
Oh, by the way, there was one more thing that I wanted to mention about the difference between a Street Advance Z and a Flex Z, and that is partially to do with the cost and the location of manufacture. The Flex Z is actually made, as you can see, in Japan. The Street Advance Z, along with the Street Bases Z, says, designed by Tein in Japan, assembled in the People's Republic of China by Tein China Manufacturing. But this last part of it is really important to note. Tein China Manufacturing is Tein. It's just like Tein in Japan, except for it's in China. We find that sometimes people are biased against a product like this that's made in China, but we want to make sure that there's a different distinction between a Chinese private label off-the-shelf sort of product and a product that's made in China by a reputable company such as Tein or Eibach or whoever. Tein has actually set up their own manufacturing plant in China, so you're actually getting a lot of the same componentry, a lot of the same build quality, and a lot of the same materials that you would on a Japanese-made product. And we've learned that many manufacturers are actually opening up facilities in China because if they don't, they'll have a harder time selling things to the Chinese market. This shouldn't really detract from the product at all, and instead, we get a really great benefit of a much lower cost product. Keep in mind that Tein is still in charge of all the quality control, and it's a really fantastic product that's been very reliable for us even after that switch to the Z line.
Alright, upper mounts or top hats. Here's a little difference between the three that you would get with your Tein suspension. If you have a base TL, you're going to see something like this with the standard rubber bushing. There's a metal collar inside there to tighten down against. The Type S TL has this metal reinforced washer within. That's on the upper and on the lower side of the upper mount. And then this is the mount that comes with a flex damper kit. It has a polyurethane bushing, actually. It's quite firm and a little bit larger washer or a collar inside there. And of course the design is meant to accept smaller diameter Tein spring versus these upper mounts, which use the Tein spring that comes with the Street Advance Z and the Street Bases Z. One of the questions people like to ask is, hey, I got a Street Advance Z, can I put the flex upper mounts on? Well, I guess you could, but you're going to need to figure out how to put a different size collar in there, and you're going to need to get new springs too. So if that's really on your radar, then you probably want to be going with a Flex Z to begin with. Really wouldn't be practical. If you have a Street Advance Z or a Street Bases Z and you want more performance bushings, we get you some of these Type S or Type R style bushings, and that's going to hook you up pretty good.
This is an upper mount for a shock assembly car. A strut type, a lot of times you'll see, has camber adjustment in it. In this particular application, you won't find that, because shocks, the way they mount into the car, won't affect the alignment angle. You won't find any camber adjustment on, let's say, any Acura TL, especially in the front. 13 and newer Accord and Civics from 2001 on have a strut type suspension, and that's why you'll see the upper mount actually has some camber adjustment. So if camber adjustment is available, especially in the front, it'll come with that camber adjustment there. We have gotten some calls from people that have like a third generation TL and saying, hey, how come I can't adjust the camber here? Well, that's because you need adjustable control arms to adjust camber in those cars. But these upper mounts basically are replacements for the factory upper mounts. When you get a Street Advance Z, you'll notice that this kit doesn't come with any upper mounts. That's because you're going to remove the old suspension from your car and take the upper mounts off the factory assemblies and reinstall them onto the Street Advance Z coilover. There's really no negative to doing that other than it's just extra work. The factory upper mounts on the Acuras and Hondas typically don't really wear, especially the ones that are for a shock type suspension. You'll find that the rubber doesn't really deteriorate. It'll compress and maybe get a little hard. The upper mounts themselves generally don't break, although we have seen them break. It's pretty rare. By and large, you don't really need to buy new upper mounts when you're putting in these suspension in your, most of your run-of-the-mill double wishbone Hondas and Acuras, but Heeltoe does offer that option. Not only do we offer the option of getting new upper mounts, we offer the option of getting them pre-installed as well. What we've done here is we've ordered all of the upper mount parts that you would need from Acura directly, and ripped them all out of the packages and assembled them onto the top of this Street Advance Z for a customer. It's a really handy thing to be able to do. Why is it handy? Well, first of all, when you take apart the factory assembly, the springs are under some compression. And in order to take the top mounts off, you're going to need to compress the spring a little bit, and not everybody has a spring compressor. It's an extra tool, plus they're kind of sketchy to use. Not only that, tightening and loosening this nut on the top, fiddle with 2 wrenches, is rather difficult. A lot of people avoid all of this by having us get the upper mount and put it on for them. It does add some extra cost to the suspension kit, but most people find that it's actually a pretty reasonable cost. And when you buy a Street Advance Z with an upper mount pre-installed, sometimes you're going to get closer to the cost of a Flex Z kit, but you're not going to get all the way there. The Street Advance Z lowers really well in the 1.5 to 2 inch range, where the Flex Z is going to get you much more low, probably up to 3 inches, maybe even a little bit more on some applications. That's why we add the upper mounts, because it adds a lot of convenience that you would normally get with a Flex Z, but in a lower cost package. We've got the washers and things all assembled just right, and we'll tighten this down to make sure that there won't get any noises or rattles or anything. I don't know how many times you've seen online somebody saying, oh, I just put in my coilovers and now I'm getting a noise. Well, I will tell you right now, I've been doing these assemblies for many years now. Probably more than 5 or 6 years we've been putting these together for people, and we've never yet had somebody come back with a noise complaint. If you feel like, making your life a little bit easier, we recommend it. And that's the main difference between Street Advance Z and Flex Z, and a lot more about our upper mount option available from Heeltoe Automotive. We're in your corner trying to make sure that we set you up with exactly the right setup for your needs, with all the convenient features that one would want to have.